They told me I was beautiful on my wedding day. They smiled for the cameras, hugged me in front of guests, even called me daughter when the priest asked if anyone objected. I believed them. I wore their grandmother's veil, ate from their crystal, danced on their marble floors. I thought I had finally found a family that saw me. Not my skin. Not my past. Just me. I was 52 years old and this was my second chance at love. My first husband had died young, leaving me alone to raise our son in a neighborhood where every door looked the same and every dream felt too expensive. But Richard was different. Soft-spoken. Patient. He held my hand like it was made of something precious. His mother had kissed my cheek at our engagement dinner. His sisters had laughed at my jokes. I went to bed that night thinking I had won something I didn't even know I'd been fighting for. The reception was perfect. White roses everywhere. A jazz band playing songs I used to hum while washing dishes in my tiny apartment. Richard's father gave a toast about love crossing all boundaries. Cried. Real tears. The kind that come from relief, not pain. I thought that speech was about us. About how a black woman from the South Side could marry into a family with oil paintings in the hallway, and a last name that opened doors. I was wrong. 3 days after the wedding I found the group chat. Richard had left his laptop open in the study. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the photographer's contact to send a thank you note. But there it was. A message thread titled, The Situation. I should have closed it. Walked away. Pretended I hadn't seen my own name next to a skull emoji. But curiosity is a knife that cuts even when you know it will. His mother wrote first. She's lovely, but let's be honest. The children will have complications. His sister replied with a link to a genetics article. Another cousin joked about whether the family Christmas card would need a disclaimer. They debated my skin tone like I was paint on a wall. Too dark for the library portraits. Too obvious in the country club photos. One of them even suggested Richard could have done better if he'd waited. I sat in that leather chair and read every word, every laugh, every careful phrase designed to sound concerned instead of cruel. They had rehearsed their smiles, practiced their warmth. My wedding had been a performance, and I was the only one who didn't know. Richard came home 2 hours later and found me still sitting there. He saw the screen. Saw my face. He didn't apologize. He said, "You weren't supposed to see that." As if the problem was my discovery, not their words. As if I had broken a rule by existing in a space they had already decided I didn't belong. How do you unring a bell like that? I had spent 30 years building a life from nothing. Worked doubles as a nurse while my son slept in hospital break rooms. Sent him to college on scholarships and savings scraped from envelopes labeled, "Maybe someday." I had survived a marriage, a funeral, and a mortgage that nearly drowned me. I had dignity. But in that moment, sitting in a house that smelled like old money and new lies, I felt like I was 12 years old again, standing outside a store while the owner followed me with his eyes. Richard begged me to understand. Said his family was old-fashioned but would come around. That I was overreacting. That love was supposed to be about forgiveness. He actually used that word. Forgiveness. As if I owed them absolution for deciding my blackness was a stain on their precious lineage. I didn't yell. Didn't throw anything. I looked at the man I had married and realized I didn't know him at all. He had seemed kind because kindness costs nothing when you're not the one paying for cruelty. He had seemed brave because he'd never had to be. I asked him one question. "Did you know they felt this way before we got married?" He hesitated. Just 2 seconds. But that pause told me everything. I spent that night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me like a trap. Could leave. Pack my things, file for annulment, disappear into my old life like this had been a bad dream. That's what they expected. What they wanted. Clean exit. No scandal. Just a quiet divorce and a story they could reshape into something more comfortable. But I wasn't built to disappear. And I had just inherited something far more valuable than their approval. I had their secrets. Their cruelty in writing. Their arrogance recorded in timestamps and read receipts. And I had time. Because at 52, I had learned that revenge isn't about anger. It's about strategy. It's about watching someone hand you the match, then waiting until they're standing in gasoline to light it. They thought I was too dark for their legacy. They had no idea I was about to rewrite it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying. I had cried enough in my life to know when tears would help and when they would just blur my vision. This was a moment that required clarity. So I lay there in that guest room with its heavy curtains and expensive sheets, listening to Richard pace in the hallway outside. And I did what I've always done when the world tries to break me. I started counting my assets. Not money. I had learned long ago that real power doesn't always come with a price tag. I counted information, relationships, credibility, the kind of capital you build over decades of showing up, doing the work, being the person everyone underestimates until it's too late. Richard's family had wealth. Old wealth. The kind that comes with portraits and property and a last name that makes lawyers return calls. But wealth without wisdom is just a bigger stage for foolishness. And they had just given me a front row seat to theirs. The group chat was my first asset. Screenshots don't lie. Timestamps don't forget. Every joke about my skin tone, every careful concern about complications, every suggestion that Richard could have chosen better. It was all there, preserved in the digital amber of their own arrogance. They had been so confident in their privacy, so certain that their family bubble was impenetrable, that they hadn't even used code words. They had typed my name, used photos from the wedding, drawn lines from my face to their fears about how the grandchildren might look. But information alone isn't power. You need the right audience, the right moment, the right consequence. I had spent 3 decades in healthcare, moving through hospital hierarchies, navigating egos far more fragile than these. I knew how institutions worked, how reputations crumbled, how one well-placed truth could unravel years of carefully constructed image. Richard's family wasn't just wealthy. They were visible. His mother sat on non-profit boards. His father consulted for foundations. His sister ran a diversity initiative at her firm. I almost laughed at that one. They had built their public identity on being the kind of people who welcomed everyone. Progressive, open-minded, evolved. Their private texts told a different story. I got up around 4 in the morning and made coffee in their kitchen. French press. Imported beans. Everything in that house was imported, including their morals. The sunrise came through the bay windows and painted everything gold, and I realized something that made my hands steady around the warm ceramic mug. They were afraid of me. Not because of anything I had done, but because of what I represented. Proof that their carefully constructed world wasn't as exclusive as they needed it to be. That their bloodline, their precious legacy, could be diluted by someone who didn't come from their side of town. That fear was my second asset. People do their worst damage when they're afraid. They get sloppy, overconfident. They document things they should whisper. They create evidence when they should create distance. And Richard's family, for all their education and etiquette, had made the amateur mistake of treating their group chat like a confessional instead of a courtroom. Every message was a confession. Every laugh was an admission. They had built their own case against themselves, and I was just the prosecutor who happened to find the file. Richard knocked on the guest room door around 7, asked if we could talk. I let him in because I needed to see his face when I asked the questions that would determine what came next. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking exhausted and smaller than I remembered. Started with apologies. Said his family didn't mean it the way it sounded. That they were just worried about me facing prejudice. That they wanted to protect any future children from the world's cruelty. I let him finish. Then I asked him about the wedding planning. About the 6 months of dress fittings and menu tastings and seating charts. About the conversations he must have had with his mother, his sisters, his cousins. About whether this was the first time they had expressed concerns, or just the first time it had been written down. He couldn't look at me. That's when I knew. This wasn't a surprise to him. It was a reality he had been managing, negotiating with, hoping I would never discover. He had married me anyway, not despite his family's racism but alongside it. Like it was a quirk he could work around. A difference of opinion rather than a fundamental betrayal of everything marriage is supposed to mean. That's when I made my decision. Not in anger, though I had plenty. Not in hurt, though that was there too. I made it in the cold, practical space where survival lives. The same place that had gotten me through nursing school with a toddler at home. The same place that had helped me rebuild after my first husband died and the bills kept coming. The same place that knew how to turn pain into strategy and grief into momentum. I was going to stay. Not because I loved Richard, that had died in the study the night before, the moment I read his silence in that group chat. But because leaving would give them exactly what they wanted. Clean exit. A quiet ending. Proof that I didn't really belong. That I couldn't handle their world. That they had been right all along. Instead, I was going to become exactly what they feared most. Not an outsider they could dismiss. Not a mistake they could erase. But a member of the family with access, with knowledge, with the kind of proximity that makes secrets impossible to keep. I was going to learn everything about their foundation, their board meetings, their fundraisers, their public commitments to inclusion and equity. I was going to smile at their events and volunteer for their causes and become so visible, so integrated, so undeniably present that removing me would require them to explain why. And when the time was right, when I had built enough credibility and collected enough evidence and positioned myself exactly where I needed to be, I was going to show the world who they really were. Not with accusations, not with anger, but with their own words, their own jokes, their own carefully typed proof that everything they claimed to believe was a performance. Richard was still talking. Something about counseling, about time, about how love conquers all. I looked at him and realized he actually believed that. Believed we could therapy our way past the fact that his family had discussed my blackness like it was a genetic defect. That I could somehow forgive my way into their acceptance. He didn't understand that I wasn't interested in their acceptance anymore. I was interested in their accountability. And I had just inherited the keys to make that happen. This is why so many people choose to stay in situations that look impossible from the outside. Not because they're weak, but because they see an angle no one else does. An opportunity disguised as an obstacle. A chance to rewrite the ending everyone else assumed was already written. I told Richard the first needed time to think. He looked relieved. Thought I was considering forgiveness. He had no idea I was planning documentation. That every conversation from this point forward would be a deposition. Every family dinner would be reconnaissance. Every smile would be strategy. They wanted me to disappear. Instead, I was about to become unforgettable. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of legacy I was rewriting. The family estate sat on 12 acres in a suburb where the trees had names and the mailboxes cost more than my first car. I had driven past neighborhoods like this my entire life, never imagining I would live in one. Now I walked its manicured paths every morning, past the garden his grandmother had designed and the fountain his great-grandfather had imported from Italy, and I studied everything. Not with the wonder of a new bride, but with the focus of someone building a map for a place she planned to navigate in the dark. Richard's mother hosted a brunch 2 weeks after the wedding. Almost said no. The guest room had become my sanctuary, the only space in that house where I didn't feel like I was performing. But staying away would signal weakness. It would confirm what they already believed, that I didn't belong, that I couldn't handle their world, that eventually I would simply fade back into whatever life they imagined I came from. So I put on a cream-colored dress, pearls I had inherited from my own mother, and walked into that sunroom like I owned it. They were all there. His mother pouring mimosas from crystal that caught the light like fractured promises. His sisters discussing their children's private schools. His aunts debating vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard versus the Hamptons. They looked up when I entered, and for just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, their faces showed something raw. Not quite guilt. More like the discomfort of seeing a mirror they hadn't asked for. Then the smiles returned. Practiced. Perfect. Hello. His mother kissed my cheek. Darling, you look lovely. That color is so flattering on you. I heard what she didn't say. The way flattering carried weight, implying that other colors wouldn't be. The way on you created separation, a subtle reminder that my skin required different considerations than theirs. These were the cuts that didn't bleed immediately. The kind you only felt hours later when you replayed the conversation and realized you'd been injured in plain sight. I sat at their table, ate their poached eggs and fresh berries, laughed at their jokes about book clubs and charity galas. And I listened, really listened. Not to what they said but to what lived underneath. The way his sister mentioned her firm's diversity initiative 3 times, like she needed everyone to know she had black colleagues. The way his aunt asked about my background, with that particular emphasis that meant she was really asking about class, about education, about whether I had the right credentials to justify my presence. The way his mother kept touching my arm, performing affection for the audience of family members who were watching to see if I would be accepted or expelled. I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about me. It was about them. About what my existence in their family revealed about the distance between who they claimed to be and who they actually were. Every progressive value they posted on social media, every donation to racial justice causes, every public statement about inclusion. I was the test they were failing in private. And they knew it. That's why they couldn't just ignore me. They had to manage me, transform me into a version they could accept, or prove that I didn't fit so they could justify pushing me out. But I had spent my entire life being underestimated. Being the black nurse in rooms full of white doctors who assumed I was there to clean instead of heal. Being the single mother in parent-teacher conferences where people spoke slowly, as if poverty had damaged my comprehension. Being the woman at the bank who had to show twice as much documentation as the person ahead of me in line. I knew how to smile through insult. How to document while appearing docile. How to build a case while everyone assumed I was just trying to survive. After brunch, Richard's mother asked me to help in the kitchen. Just the 2 of us. She washed dishes at a sink that probably cost more than a semester of my son's college tuition. And she talked about family. About legacy. About how the Westwood name, Richard's family name, carried responsibilities, expectations, standards that had been maintained for generations. You understand, don't you? She said, not looking at me. It's not about you personally. It's about preserving something precious. Something that took centuries to build. I dried a plate slowly. Let the silence stretch. Then I asked the question I had been holding since the night I found that group chat. What exactly are you trying to preserve? The money? The reputation? Or the whiteness? She turned to me then, and her face did something complicated. Anger, fear, respect. Like she hadn't expected me to name the thing they had all been dancing around. She opened her mouth, closed it, finally said, "You're twisting my words." But I wasn't. I was clarifying them. And she knew it. That's the thing about racism in spaces like this. It requires everyone to participate in the lie. To pretend it's about tradition or culture or family values. Anything except what it actually is. The moment someone refuses to play along, the whole performance collapses. I finished drying the plate, set it down gently, told her I appreciated her honesty, even the parts she didn't say out loud. Then I walked back to the sunroom where Richard was laughing with his cousins, oblivious to the fact that his mother and I had just drawn lines that couldn't be uncrossed. That night I started my research. Not dramatic investigation. Nothing that would leave digital footprints. Just simple public records. Tax filings for the family foundation. Board minutes from the nonprofit his mother chaired. Donation histories. Grant applications. I pulled everything available through legal channels. The kind of information anyone could access if they knew where to look and had the patience to read hundreds of pages of bureaucratic language. What I found didn't surprise me. It disappointed me, which is somehow worse. The foundation his mother ran gave exactly 1 scholarship per year to a student of color. 1 out of 15 annual awards. The non-profit she chaired had a website full of diverse faces, but the actual board, 11 members, 10 white, 1 Asian woman who had been added the previous year, Probably when someone pointed out how the optics looked. Richard's sister's diversity initiative at her law firm. Found the press release. Lots of language about commitment and inclusion. But when I cross-referenced with their actual hiring data, publicly available because they were a government contractor, the numbers told a different story. They had hired exactly 3 black associates in the past 5 years. 2 had left within 18 months. The third was still there, probably holding on, collecting evidence of her own. This was the legacy they were so desperate to preserve. Not excellence, not achievement, just the appearance of it, built on a foundation of exclusion they had learned to describe in language polite enough for brunch. I saved everything. Created folders with bland names like Family Foundation Research and Non-Profit Info. Backed it up in 3 places. Then I did something that would have seemed crazy to anyone watching. I volunteered. Told Richard's mother I wanted to get involved with the foundation's work. That I had experience in healthcare and maybe could help with their wellness initiatives. She looked startled, then pleased. Like I was finally accepting my place. Learning to be grateful. She had no idea I was walking into her world with a recorder running, not literal. I didn't need that, but mental. Every meeting would be noted. Every contradiction documented. Every promise that didn't match the data would become part of a pattern. Richard thought I was healing. Moving forward. He started sleeping in our bedroom again, talking about the future, making plans for holidays and trips. He thought my silence meant acceptance. He didn't understand it meant preparation. Because here's what I learned in 30 years of surviving. The people who hurt you are rarely punished by your anger. They're punished by your patience. By your willingness to wait until they forget you're watching, until they relax back into their true selves, until they create the evidence you need without even realizing they're building your case for you. And Richard's family was about to give me everything I needed. They just didn't know it yet. The foundation meetings happened every 3rd Thursday. I attended my first one in October, 6 weeks after the wedding. The conference room had the kind of view people pay extra for. Windows overlooking a private garden, original artwork on the walls, chairs that probably cost more than my monthly salary used to be. People sat around that table. Richard's mother at the head. Her assistant taking notes. 5 board members I had never met. Me. They welcomed me warmly. Too warmly. The way people do when they're performing generosity for an audience, even if that audience is just themselves. Richard's mother introduced me as our newest family member who's eager to contribute. Not by name at first. Just by my relationship to them, my proximity to their world. Smiled. Shook hands. Sat in the chair they had pulled out for me like I was a guest instead of someone who had married into the room. The meeting started with budget reports. Numbers that made my throat tight. Not because they were large, though they were, but because of how casually they discussed them. 100,000 for marketing. 50,000 for an event planner. 20,000 for photography. Then, almost as an afterthought, 15,000 total for the scholarships that were supposed to be the foundation's core mission. The money spent on making the foundation look good was nearly 10 times what they spent on actually helping anyone. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I had learned long ago that the first meeting is for listening. For understanding the dynamics. For figuring out who holds real power and who just thinks they do. Richard's mother ran the meeting, but one of the board members, an older man named Robert who wore cufflinks that caught the light when he gestured, kept redirecting the conversation. Suggesting. Correcting. Reframing. He was the money. She was the name. Together they controlled everything, and everyone else in that room was just there to make it look like democracy. When they got to the scholarship discussion, I paid attention differently. They talked about the recipients like they were projects. Success stories they could post on the website. One girl had gone to nursing school, they kept emphasizing that, looking at me like it created some kind of bond. Like my career made me responsible for celebrating their single scholarship to a black student pursuing the same path. They didn't mention the hundreds of other applicants. Didn't discuss why only 1 scholarship out of 15 went to students of color when the application pool was far more diverse. They just moved on to the gala planning, where they would spend more on flower arrangements than they gave to students all year. After the meeting, Robert approached me, asked about my background, where I went to school, how I met Richard. All polite questions with sharp edges, the kind designed to establish hierarchy while seeming friendly. I answered honestly. Community college before transferring to state school. Met Richard at a hospital fundraiser where I was working and he was donating. Robert nodded like he was confirming something he already suspected. "It's good Richard found someone grounded," he said. "Someone who understands what real work looks like." Sounded like a compliment. But what I heard underneath was clear. I was useful as contrast. As proof that the family could accept someone from my background, as long as I stayed grateful and didn't ask why there was a background to overcome in the first place. I drove home that afternoon thinking about my son. He was 30 now, working as an engineer in another state, building a life I had once only imagined for him. I had pushed him through every door I couldn't open myself. Worked doubles so he could have tutoring. Moved to better school districts even when it meant smaller apartments. Taught him to be twice as good to be considered half as equal. He knew that math before he could spell his own name. And here I was, sitting in rooms where people spent more on catering than they gave to students who needed exactly what my son had needed. Just a chance. Just someone to believe their potential was worth investing in. It wasn't anger I felt driving home. It was something colder. Clarity. The kind that comes when you realize the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. And the people running it have convinced themselves they're generous because they occasionally let someone through the gate. That night I started mapping connections. Not just the foundation but everything it touched. The board members all served on other boards. Robert was connected to 3 major corporations. Richard's mother sat on committees at the museum, the symphony, the private school where his nieces attended. Every institution was linked, every family was connected. And at the center of it all was this idea that they deserved their access because they had earned it through generations of hard work. They never mentioned that those generations had access to loans my grandparents were legally denied. To schools my parents couldn't attend. To neighborhoods where deeds explicitly prohibited selling to black families. They talked about legacy like it was merit instead of what it actually was. Inherited advantage compounded over time until it looked natural. I started documenting everything in a journal. Not on my computer where Richard might see. Old-fashioned pen and paper, kept in my purse. Meeting notes, quotes I remembered. Discrepancies between what the foundation claimed in public and what they actually did in private. It's at this point that many people feel the impulse to support this kind of journey, leaving a quiet signal that the message resonates, that the truth matters even when it's uncomfortable to hear. Richard asked if I enjoyed the meeting. Said yes. He looked relieved. Told me his mother thought I was fitting in beautifully. That I had a natural grace that impressed everyone. I almost laughed. Grace. Like my ability to sit quietly while they discussed budgets that revealed their priorities was some kind of virtue. Like my silence was elegance instead of strategy. But I kept that thought to myself. Because I was learning their language now. Understanding how they communicated in code. How they used words like culture fit and traditional values and preserving excellence to mean things they couldn't say directly. And once you understand the code, you can start to decode everything else. The hiring practices that favored legacy applicants. The scholarship criteria that required recommendation letters from people in their network. The grant applications that rewarded organizations already connected to their world. It was genius, really. A closed system that appeared open. A gate that seemed welcoming until you realized the key was inherited and no one was making new copies. 3 months passed. I attended every meeting. Volunteered for committees. Helped plan the gala that would raise money they would mostly spend on raising more money. I smiled at their events. Posed for photos that would go on the website under Our Community. Became exactly what they wanted. Visible enough to prove their inclusivity, quiet enough not to challenge their comfort. And while I played that role, I collected everything. Every promise they made publicly that contradicted their private actions. Every statistic they misrepresented. Every policy that looked neutral but produced predictably unequal results. I wasn't gathering evidence for a courtroom. I was building something more permanent. Record. Counter-narrative. The kind of documentation that couldn't be explained away because it came from their own materials, their own words, their own numbers. Richard's family thought I was integrating, learning to belong. They had no idea I was archiving. That every smile I gave them was a placeholder for the reckoning I was building. That my patience wasn't acceptance. It was preparation. Because the thing about legacies is they're only as strong as the stories holding them up. And I was about to introduce a new story. One they couldn't control. One that would rewrite everything they thought they had built. But first I needed them to trust me completely. To forget I had ever seen that group chat. To believe I had moved past it, forgiven it, accepted my place in their world. And they were almost there. The gala was scheduled for late January. 6 months after the wedding. Long enough that I had become a familiar face. Short enough that people still introduced me as Richard's new wife, instead of just by my name. The event was their showcase. The moment when donors saw where their money went, when board members performed their commitment to education, when the foundation's public image was polished to a shine that would carry them through another year of doing the bare minimum while claiming transformative impact. I was assigned to the welcome committee, greeting guests, handing out programs, smiling beside Richard's mother while photographers captured moments that would later appear in society pages and foundation newsletters. She had chosen my dress. Sent it to the house with a note saying she thought the color would be stunning on me. It was burgundy. Deep enough to be elegant, dark enough that I understood the subtext. Nothing too bright, nothing that would draw attention away from the people who mattered. I wore it anyway. Not because I agreed, but because I needed her to believe I was cooperating. That I had accepted my role. That I understood my place was decorative, supportive, grateful. Richard told me I looked beautiful. Kissed my cheek before we left for the venue. Said his mother was so pleased with how well I had adapted. How natural I seemed in their world now. Natural. Like I was a plant they had successfully transplanted. Like my roots hadn't been violently torn from one soil and forced into another. But I smiled. Thanked him. Let him believe whatever story made him comfortable. The ballroom was exactly what you would expect. Crystal chandeliers. Sculptures. Tables draped in fabric that cost more per yard than most people spent on groceries in a month. The program featured speeches from board members about their commitment to educational equity. About believing in potential regardless of background. About investing in the next generation of leaders. Every word carefully chosen to sound progressive while committing to nothing specific. I stood at the entrance shaking hands with people who had never missed a meal they didn't choose to skip. Women in diamonds that could have funded full scholarships. Men in custom suits discussing stock portfolios between sips of champagne that cost more per bottle than the foundation gave in monthly stipends to the students they claimed to support. And they all felt good about being there. Generous. Enlightened. Part of the solution. One woman stopped to chat with me. Asked how I was enjoying being part of the family. Told me she had noticed me at the last few meetings and thought it was wonderful that Richard had married someone with such a real background. I knew what she meant. Real as in poor. Real as in struggle. Real as in I could be pointed to as proof they cared about people like me, as long as I stayed grateful and didn't ask why there had to be people like me in the first place. Thanked her. Asked about her involvement with the foundation. She lit up. Told me she had been on the board for 8 years. That it was the most fulfilling work she did. That knowing she was changing lives made everything worthwhile. I asked how many scholarship recipients she had personally met. She paused. Said she thought there had been one at a luncheon a few years ago, but she couldn't quite remember. Then someone called her name and she floated away, already forgetting our conversation, already moving on to the next performance of caring. That's when I understood the final piece. These people weren't intentionally cruel. That would have required awareness. They were simply insulated. So thoroughly wrapped in their privilege that they experienced their own comfort as virtue. They donated to the foundation and felt heroic. Attended the gala and felt involved. Posted about educational equity on social media and felt progressive. And none of it required them to actually change anything. Not their neighborhoods. Not their schools. Not their hiring practices. Not the systems that ensured their children would inherit the same advantages they had. The scholarship recipients were brought on stage before dinner. 4 students. 3 white, 1 Asian. No black students this year. No Latino students. The foundation's website had shown diverse applicants, had used language about reaching underserved communities, had posted statistics suggesting broad impact. But standing on that stage, smiling for cameras, were 4 students who looked like they could have been admitted anywhere without the scholarship. Safe choices. Comfortable diversity. The kind that didn't challenge anyone's assumptions about merit or belonging. Richard's mother gave a speech about the foundation's mission. About how every child deserved a chance. About how education was the great equalizer. I watched from the side of the room and thought about the group chat. About the jokes regarding my skin tone. About their concerns for future grandchildren. About how quickly every child became certain children when you looked at who actually received support. She mentioned me during the speech, gestured in my direction, said something about how the foundation was growing, bringing in new perspectives, evolving to meet the needs of a changing world. People applauded, turned to smile at me, waved, played my part. Let them believe I represented change instead of what I actually was. Documentation of their hypocrisy. After dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom. Walked past the ballroom into a quiet hallway where the noise faded to a murmur behind heavy doors. I stood there for a moment, looking at my reflection in a gilded mirror. The dress his mother had chosen. The pearls I had inherited from my own mother, who had cleaned houses in neighborhoods like this but never been invited inside as a guest. The smile I had worn all evening like armor. I thought about my son again. About the scholarship applications he had filled out at our kitchen table. Hands cramped from writing essays about overcoming adversity. About the hours I had spent helping him research programs, edit applications, prepare for interviews. About the rejection letters that arrived before acceptances, the waiting, the hoping, the understanding that he would have to be exceptional just to be considered adequate. He had made it. Through community college first because we couldn't afford university right away. Through scholarships he earned by being twice as good. Through internships he worked harder at than his peers because he knew he was being judged differently. He succeeded despite systems like this, not because of them. And now I was standing in a ballroom full of people who claimed to create opportunities while actually just recycling privilege through their own networks. Pulled out my phone. Took a photo of the program. Not for social media. For my records. Another piece of evidence. Another data point in the pattern I was building. Then I went back to the ballroom, back to my role, back to the performance. Richard found me near the end of the evening. Told me everyone had been asking about me. That his mother was thrilled with how the night had gone. That I had been perfect. He said it like a compliment, not understanding that perfection in their world required me to erase everything that made me who I was. To sand down my edges until I fit their frame. To be grateful for access to spaces my taxes helped fund, but my presence supposedly diminished. Kissed him on the cheek. Told him I was glad it went well. Let him interpret my words however he needed to. On the drive home, he talked about the donations they had secured. Big numbers. Impressive commitments. Money that would fund more galas, more marketing, more performances of generosity. I asked how much would go directly to scholarships. He hesitated. Said the foundation needed to maintain operational excellence to ensure long-term impact. He nodded. Didn't push. Just filed that answer away with everything else I was collecting. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety. From clarity. I had everything I needed now. 6 months of meeting notes. Documentation of budget allocations. Photos of events where they claimed diversity while practicing exclusion. Quotes from board members contradicting their public statements. The group chat from the wedding that started it all. And now, a gala that perfectly encapsulated everything they were. Beautiful on the surface, hollow underneath. Got up. Went to my study. Started organizing files. Not frantically. Methodically. The way you do when you're building something meant to last. Something that can't be dismissed or explained away. Something that tells a story so clear, so documented, so undeniable that it becomes its own truth. Richard's family thought they had written their legacy in stone. In foundation bylaws and family trusts and traditions passed down through generations. They thought their story was already told, already secure, already beyond question. They were wrong. Because legacies aren't written in stone. They're written in choices. And I was about to show them exactly what choices they had been making while they weren't paying attention. I spent the next 3 weeks building something I had never built before. Not a case in the legal sense, though it had that precision. Not an accusation, though it contained truth that would sting. What I created was a story told in data. A narrative constructed from their own documents, their own words, their own choices. Every spreadsheet was a chapter. Every policy contradiction was a plot point. Every public statement that didn't match private action was a moment of dramatic irony. I worked in the early mornings before Richard woke up, and late at night after he fell asleep. The house was quietest then. Just me and the weight of what I was assembling. I created a simple website. Nothing flashy. No accusations in the headline. Just a title that posed a question. Does the Westwood Foundation practice what it preaches? Underneath, I laid out everything in clean, undeniable sections. The first section showed their mission statement beside their actual scholarship distribution over 5 years. They claimed to serve underrepresented communities. The data showed 87% of scholarships went to students from families already in their network. Students whose parents were donors. Students who attended the same private schools as board members' children. The kind of students who didn't need scholarships so much as resume lines. The second section documented their gala spending versus direct student support. Graphs that showed they spent more on a single event than they distributed in scholarships all year. Not my interpretation. Just their tax filings, publicly available, arranged in a way that told the story they had been hiding inside bureaucratic language and accountant speak. The third section was the board composition over a decade. Photos pulled from their own website archives. Year after year of faces that looked the same. One token edition every few years, always carefully chosen, always leaving the power structure untouched. I included their own diversity statements alongside these images. Let the contradiction speak for itself. But the fourth section was the one that made my hands shake while I built it. The group chat from my wedding. Screenshots with timestamps. Their jokes about my skin. Their concerns about bloodline. Their casual cruelty rendered in 12-point font. I didn't editorialize. Didn't add commentary. Just presented it exactly as it was with one caption. Private messages from Foundation leadership, sent 3 days after my wedding to their family. I sat back when it was finished. Looked at the screen. This wasn't revenge in the explosive sense. No screaming confrontation. No dramatic scene. It was something quieter and more permanent. A mirror held up to people who had spent decades avoiding their own reflection. A record that couldn't be deleted or explained away because it came entirely from their own materials. The question was timing. When to release it. How to ensure it reached the people who needed to see it. Not just their social circle, but the donors who believed in their mission, the students who had been rejected, the community organizations they claimed to partner with but actually ignored. I needed this to spread before they could contain it. To become part of the permanent record before they could rewrite the narrative. I thought about my mother during those weeks. She had died 5 years before I met Richard, but I felt her presence while I worked. She had cleaned houses her entire life. Scrubbed toilets in homes where she wasn't allowed to use the front door. Raised me and my siblings on wages that barely covered rent, let alone dignity. She used to tell me that patience was a weapon people didn't expect from black women. That everyone assumed our anger would be loud, public, immediate. But she knew better. She knew that the most effective resistance was often the quietest. The kind that dismantled systems from the inside while everyone thought you were just trying to survive. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was trying to rewrite what survival meant. Richard started noticing I was distant. Asked if everything was okay. If I was happy. I told him I was adjusting. That marriage was harder than I expected. That I missed my independence sometimes. All true statements, just not in the way he understood them. He thought I was struggling with the transition to his world. He didn't know I was documenting it for demolition. His mother invited me to lunch in mid-February. Just the two of us. She chose a restaurant where everyone knew her name, where the staff treated her like visiting royalty, where the menu didn't list prices because if you had to ask, you didn't belong. We sat by the window. She ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. Then she leaned forward and took my hand. "I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said. "The way you've integrated into our family. The grace you've shown. It can't have been easy." I looked at her carefully manicured fingers wrapped around my hand and felt nothing. Not anger. Not hurt. Just distance. Like I was watching this moment from somewhere far away, already knowing how it would end. "Why wouldn't it be easy?" I asked. She hesitated, chose her words carefully. "You come from such a different background. Different values. Different expectations. But you've adapted beautifully. You've learned to fit in. Fit in. Like I was furniture being arranged. Like my entire existence was about conforming to their aesthetics." Smiled. Told her I appreciated her support. Let her believe I was grateful for her approval instead of what I actually felt, which was pity. Pity that she had lived 50 years in this world and never once questioned whether the fit she demanded from others was violence disguised as etiquette. She talked about the foundation's spring plans. About expanding the scholarship program. About how my presence had inspired them to think more broadly about diversity. I listened and thought about the website waiting on my laptop. About how every word she was saying would soon be measured against the evidence I had collected. About how inspiration wasn't the same as action, and how I was about to make that distinction impossible to ignore. We finished lunch. She paid. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot. She told me she loved me. I said it back because the words cost nothing and bought me time. But driving home I realized something that made my chest tight. I didn't hate her. I almost wished I did. Hate would have been simpler, cleaner. But what I felt was more complicated. Sadness for what she had become. For what she had chosen to protect instead of question. For how thoroughly she had convinced herself that her comfort was the same as correctness. That night I set the publication date. 2 weeks away. Enough time to send anonymous tips to journalists who covered nonprofit accountability. To education advocates who tracked foundation spending. To the students who had applied for scholarships and been rejected while watching far less qualified candidates get selected. I would send them all the same link. No accusations in my message. Just a question. Is this the kind of foundation that deserves public trust? The evidence would do the rest. It always does. When you build a case carefully enough, people reach their own conclusions. They don't need you to tell them what to think. They just need access to the information that's been kept from them. Richard came home late that night. Found me in the study. Asked what I was working on. Closed my laptop. Told him just some research. He kissed the top of my head. Said he was glad I had found ways to stay busy. That his mother had told him about lunch. That she thought I was finally truly happy. Happy. I turned that word over in my mind after he left the room. Was I happy? Well, but I was something better. I was clear. I knew exactly what I was doing and why. I knew the cost and I had decided it was worth paying. I was trading the illusion of belonging for the integrity of truth. And that trade, painful as it was, felt more honest than anything I had experienced in this house. 2 weeks. 14 days until their legacy met my documentation. Until their story confronted the facts they had been hiding. Until the question I had been asked since the wedding, whether I was too dark for their lineage, became irrelevant compared to whether they were too hollow for their own mission. I had rewritten their narrative. Now I just had to publish it. The morning I published the website, I woke up before dawn. Didn't set an alarm. My body just knew. I made coffee in the kitchen where I had first learned to navigate their imported appliances and custom cabinets, and I sat at the table watching the sky change from black to gray to pale blue. Richard was still asleep upstairs. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I pulled up the website on my phone one last time. Checked every link, every image, every citation. Then I hit publish. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarms went off. No phone calls flooded in. The site just went live, sitting quietly on the internet, waiting to be discovered. I had sent the anonymous tips the night before. Timed emails to journalists, advocacy groups, former scholarship applicants. Simple messages with a link and a single line. You might want to see this. No signature. No explanation. Just the invitation to look. I went through my morning routine. Showered. Dressed. Made breakfast. Richard came down around 7, kissed my cheek, asked if I had slept well. Told him yes. He scrolled through his phone while eating toast, checking emails, reading news, completely unaware that somewhere in the digital noise, a story about his family was beginning to spread. The first response came around 9. An email to the generic contact address I had created for the website. A woman who had applied for a Westwood Foundation scholarship 3 years earlier. She had been rejected despite a perfect academic record and a compelling essay about overcoming barriers. She wrote, "Thank you for this. I thought it was just me. I thought I wasn't good enough. Now I know I was exactly good enough, just not connected enough." More messages followed throughout the morning. Students, parents, teachers who had encouraged their students to apply. Community organizers who had partnered with the foundation only to watch promised support evaporate. Each one a story of disappointment that had been private, personal, easy to dismiss as individual failure. But together, arranged in my inbox like evidence in a trial, they became a pattern. Proof that what had happened to me wasn't exceptional. It was standard practice. By noon, a local education journalist had posted about the website on social media. Not a full article yet, just a thread noting the discrepancies between the foundation's public claims and actual data. But that thread got shared, then shared again, then picked up by a non-profit accountability watchdog who had apparently been curious about the Westwood Foundation for years but never had enough documentation to publish anything substantial. I watched it spread like ink in water, slow at first, then faster, then everywhere at once. Richard's phone rang around 2. His mother. I could hear her voice through the speaker even though he had it pressed to his ear. High-pitched, frantic. He looked at me with confusion, then shock, then something that might have been betrayal. He walked into his study, closed the door. I stayed in the living room, listening to the muffled rise and fall of his voice, knowing exactly what conversation was happening without hearing the words. When he came out 20 minutes later, his face was pale. "Did you know about this?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "About what?" "Someone published a website. About the foundation. About my family. They have private messages. Screenshots. Financial data. They're saying." He stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence. Because what they were saying was true, and he knew it. "I saw it this morning," I said. "Not a lie. Just not the whole truth. It's all over my feed." He sat down heavily on the couch. Ran his hands through his hair. "My mother thinks it's someone from inside. Someone who had access to meetings. To documents." He looked at me then. Really looked. And I saw the moment the possibility entered his mind. The moment he started calculating timelines. My involvement with the foundation. My presence at meetings. My quiet documentation that he had interpreted as integration. "You think I did this?" asked, keeping my voice steady. "No. Course not. I just..." He stopped again. Because he couldn't say what he was thinking without accusing me. And accusing me would mean admitting he suspected I had reason to do it. Which would mean admitting the group chat. Comments. The racism he had tried to pretend didn't exist. We sat in silence. The afternoon light coming through the windows felt different somehow. "Harper," like it was exposing things that had been hidden in softer illumination. Finally, Richard spoke. They're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow. They want to figure out who did this and how to respond. He nodded, said nothing. Let him fill the silence with his own anxiety. That night, more articles appeared. A non-profit news outlet published a deep analysis comparing the Westwood Foundation's practices to industry standards. They found similar patterns at other family foundations: high overhead, low direct impact, scholarship selection that favored the already privileged. But the Westwood Foundation became the case study, the example, the proof that good intentions weren't enough when systems remained unchanged. Silence. Long enough that I knew he was choosing words carefully. She thinks you might have information about who could have accessed the documents, who was at meetings, who might have had motivation. And what do you think, Richard? Another pause. I think if you know something, now would be the time to tell me. I looked out the window. A woman was pushing a stroller. A man was arguing on his phone. Life continuing normally while somewhere else. Consequences were finally catching up to choices made in private. I think your family spent decades building a reputation, and now they're discovering that reputations only last as long as they're deserved. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. He hung up. I sat there holding my phone, knowing that conversation had just shifted something fundamental between us. He suspected, maybe even knew. But saying it out loud would require him to confront everything he had been avoiding since the day I found that group chat. Would require him to choose between his family and his wife. Between protecting their legacy and acknowledging their harm. I didn't need him to choose. The choice had already been made. Not by me, by them. The moment they decided my blackness was something to overcome rather than simply accept. The moment they made jokes about bloodlines and complications. The moment they built systems that looked inclusive but practiced exclusion. They had chosen. I just documented the choice. The afternoon brought more coverage. Op-eds about non-profit accountability. Interviews with experts on foundation oversight. Think pieces about how wealthy families use philanthropy as reputation management rather than genuine community investment. The Westwood Foundation had become a case study. Symbol. Not because they were uniquely bad, but because they were typically dishonest. They represented a pattern so common it had become invisible, until someone made it visible. That evening I went home. Richard was in his study with the door closed. I could hear him on the phone, probably with lawyers, probably discussing how to contain this, how to manage the narrative, how to find out who was responsible so they could shift focus from the content to the source. Classic deflection. Attack the messenger when you can't dispute the message. I made dinner for myself. Ate alone at the kitchen table. Thought about my son. Called him while cleaning up. He had seen the news. Asked if I was okay. If I was safe. If this was going to blow back on me somehow. I told him I was fine. That sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing. That he had taught me that through his own courage, pushing through systems designed to exclude him, succeeding despite barriers, refusing to shrink himself to fit spaces that weren't built for him. I'm proud of you, Mom, he said. Not asking if I did it. Just knowing. The way children know their parents even when words aren't spoken. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the darkening yard. The estate that had seemed so impressive 6 months ago now felt like a monument to emptiness. Beautiful on the outside. Hollow within. Built to impress rather than serve. Designed to signal status rather than create value. Richard's family had thought their legacy was secure. Written in stone through generations of carefully maintained advantage. But legacies aren't stone. They're stories. And stories can be rewritten by anyone brave enough to tell the truth. I had told it. Now I just had to wait and see if truth was still powerful enough to matter. The investigation started within 48 hours. Not a real investigation. There were no detectives, no subpoenas, just expensive lawyers hired to find the source of the leak and craft a narrative that would minimize damage. Richard told me they were reviewing access logs from their database. checking who had been at which meetings, cross-referencing timestamps on the screenshots with attendance records, building a profile of who could have possibly compiled all that information. I listened to him explain this over breakfast 3 days after publication. His voice was clinical, like he was describing a problem at work instead of the unraveling of his family's reputation. He kept watching me while he talked, not quite accusing, not quite trusting, just measuring, trying to reconcile the woman he thought he married with the possibility that she might have systematically documented his family's failures for 6 months. They think it has to be someone who understands foundations, he said. Someone with non-profit experience. Someone who knew where to look for the right data. I buttered my toast. That could be anyone on your board. Most of them sit on multiple foundations. True. But this person also had access to private family communications. The group chat from the wedding. He paused, set down his coffee. There were only 12 people in that chat. I met his eyes. Are you asking me something, Richard? He looked away first. No. Just thinking out loud. But we both knew what he was really doing. Building a case in his mind. Calculating probabilities. Weighing evidence against loyalty. Trying to decide if protecting me was worth the cost of admitting his family had given me reason to do this. The foundation released a statement that afternoon. They were implementing immediate reforms. Expanding their scholarship criteria. Adding community representatives to the board. Increasing the percentage of funds going directly to students. All changes that looked substantial on paper, but were carefully worded to allow for minimal actual transformation. They announced these reforms like they were innovative ideas rather than basic practices most legitimate foundations had implemented decades ago. The media coverage shifted slightly. Some outlets praised the foundation's responsiveness, noted that they were taking accountability seriously. Others pointed out that reforms announced under pressure weren't the same as reforms implemented proactively. That being forced to change wasn't the same as choosing to change. The comment sections remained brutal. People who had been harmed by the foundation's practices weren't interested in promises. They wanted to see results. They wanted to know who would be held accountable for years of documented exclusion. I received a message through the website contact form. From a woman named Diana who had been one of the few scholarship recipients of color over the past decade. She wrote about her experience. How isolating it had been. How the foundation had used her image in marketing materials but never actually supported her beyond the initial check. How she had felt like a token. Proof they weren't racist. Evidence they cared about diversity. But when she had struggled, when she had reached out for mentorship or additional resources, she was told the scholarship was already generous and she should be grateful. Her message ended with a question. Were you one of us? Is that why you understood exactly what to document? I didn't respond. Couldn't risk confirming anything while the investigation was active. But I saved her message. Added it to a folder I had created for all the responses. Hundreds of them now. Stories of rejection, tokenization, broken promises. Systems that claimed fairness while practicing favoritism. Each one a piece of evidence that this wasn't about one foundation's failure. It was about a pattern. Social media exploded. Former scholarship recipients shared their stories. Teachers posted about students they had encouraged to apply, watching them get rejected while less qualified but better connected candidates were selected. One comment thread became particularly viral. People sharing screenshots of foundation marketing materials alongside the actual data from my website. The contrast was devastating. Every claim undermined by their own numbers. I read through the responses late into the night. Some were angry. Some were sad. Many were from people saying they had suspected something was wrong but felt powerless to challenge it. That seeing the documentation gave them permission to trust their instincts. That proof mattered in ways anger alone never could. And I realized something profound. I hadn't just exposed the Westwood Foundation. I had given voice to everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough when the real issue was they weren't connected enough. If you've ever felt that sting, being rejected not for lack of merit but lack of access, Share your story in the comments. Because this isn't just about one foundation. It's about every system that claims fairness while practicing favoritism. Richard couldn't sleep. I heard him pacing downstairs, making calls, his voice tight with stress. I lay in our bed, though it had never really felt like ours, and thought about what came next. The board meeting would be chaos. They would look for someone to blame. They would try to discredit the information, claim it was taken out of context, insist their intentions were pure even if execution was flawed. They would do what powerful people always do when confronted with accountability. Protect themselves first, address the problem second. But the conversation had already shifted. The documentation was public. The patterns were clear. And most importantly, the people they had failed were speaking up. No longer isolated in their disappointment. No longer willing to blame themselves for a system designed to exclude them. I had rewritten their legacy. Not with accusations or anger. With their own words. Their own data. Their own choices laid bare for examination. And now I had to watch what happened when a family built on inherited advantage confronted the evidence of how they had maintained it. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Richard left the house at 8. His suit perfectly pressed. His face drawn with exhaustion. He asked me one more time if I knew anything. I looked him in the eye and told him I knew what everyone knew. That the website existed and the information on it was accurate. Not a lie. Just not the confession he was fishing for. He nodded. Kissed my forehead out of habit rather than affection. Then he was gone. I waited 30 minutes. Then I got in my car and drove to the foundation offices. Not to attend the meeting. I wasn't board leadership, just a volunteer who had been useful for optics. But I parked across the street where I could see the entrance. Watched board members arrive one by one. Robert with his expensive briefcase. Richard's mother in sunglasses despite the overcast sky, hiding from cameras that hadn't arrived yet but might. The other members looking serious, important, like people about to solve a crisis rather than people who had created one. I sat in my car and thought about power. Real power, not the inherited kind. The kind you build through patience and precision. Through understanding that exposure isn't about volume. It's about timing. About knowing exactly when to reveal what you know so it lands with maximum impact and minimum escape routes. I had given them 6 months to show me who they were when they thought no one was watching. They had failed spectacularly. And now the watching had become public. My phone buzzed constantly. Messages from people I had met at foundation events. Asking if I had seen the website. Asking what I thought. Asking if I knew who was behind it. I responded carefully. Said it looked thoroughly researched. Said the data seemed to match what I had observed. Never claimed credit. Never denied involvement. Just stayed in the gray space between truth and confession, letting people draw their own conclusions. A news van pulled up around 11. Then another. Someone had tipped off the media that the emergency meeting was happening. Probably one of the journalists I had contacted. Or maybe just someone who understood that a prominent foundation in crisis was a story worth covering. Reporters set up on the sidewalk. Cameras pointed at the building entrance. Waiting for someone to emerge with a statement. I started my car. Drove away before anyone could notice me watching. Because this part wasn't about me being visible. It was about them being exposed. About their choices becoming public record. About the gap between their mission and their methods being documented in real time. I went to a coffee shop downtown. Ordered something I didn't really want and sat by the window with my laptop. Refreshed the website analytics. Thousands of visitors in less than 24 hours. Comments flooding in. Shares spreading across platforms I hadn't even posted to directly. The story had taken on its own momentum. It didn't need me anymore. It was sustained by everyone who had their own version of this experience. Everyone who had been evaluated by systems that claimed merit but practiced nepotism. Everyone who had been told they weren't quite right for opportunities that somehow always went to people who already had everything. Around noon, Richard's mother emerged from the building. I watched on a live stream someone had started. She read from a prepared statement, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly. The foundation took these allegations seriously. They were conducting an internal review. They remained committed to their mission. All the standard crisis management language. Nothing that acknowledged the actual problem. Nothing that admitted fault. Just carefully worded deflection designed to buy time and preserve reputation. The reporters asked questions. Did she deny the accuracy of the data? She said it lacked context. Did she have a response to the private messages included on the website? She said those were taken from a moment of stress and didn't represent true feelings. Did she think the foundation had a diversity problem? She said they were always working to improve. Every answer dug the hole deeper. Because when you respond to documented evidence with vague promises to do better, you're essentially admitting the evidence is accurate. You're just hoping people will accept performance over change. But the comment section on every article, every social media post, every forum discussing this story showed that people were done accepting performance. They wanted accountability. Closed my laptop. Got back. Watched people pass by the coffee shop window. Regular people going about regular days, unaware that a few miles away a foundation was imploding because someone had finally documented what everyone had quietly known, that legacy isn't the same as merit, and access isn't the same as equity. My phone rang. Richard. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Then again. Finally I answered. Where are you? His voice was tight. Getting coffee. Why? My mother wants to talk to you. About what? Structure. A way that wealth perpetuated itself by appearing generous while actually just recycling privilege through increasingly sophisticated mechanisms. Richard's mother called that evening. Asked if she could come over. I said yes because refusing would look suspicious. She arrived in a car service, not her usual luxury sedan. Dressed simply. No jewelry. Like she had consulted with a crisis management team about how to appear humble, relatable, human. We sat in the living room. She looked older than she had at the gala. Lines around her mouth that makeup couldn't hide. Exhaustion in her eyes that money couldn't fix. She folded her hands in her lap like she was praying or pleading. Maybe both. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to be honest with me. I waited. Did you do this? The question hung in the air between us. Could have lied. Could have denied it completely. Could have acted offended that she would even suggest it. But I was tired of performing. Tired of pretending. Tired of protecting their comfort at the expense of truth. Does it matter? Yes. She blinked. Of course it matters. If someone in the family. I mean, does it matter who revealed it? Or does it matter that it was true? She stopped. Opened her mouth. Closed it. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Like the script she'd prepared didn't include this response. Like she had expected denial or confession, not a question that reframed the entire conversation. The data on that website, I continued. The budget allocations. The scholarship statistics. The board composition. Was any of it false? It lacked context. Context is what you add to facts when you don't like what they reveal. She stood up, paced to the window, looked out at the garden her grandmother had designed and her mother had maintained, and she had inherited without ever questioning whether inheritance was the same as earning. You don't understand what you've done. The damage this has caused. Not just to the foundation. To the family. To Richard. I understand perfectly. I understand that your family spent decades building a reputation on work you didn't actually do. That you claimed to value inclusion while practicing exclusion. That you made me feel like my blackness was a problem to manage instead of simply part of who I am. I understand all of that. She turned to face me. That group chat. Those messages. We were just being honest. That's the problem. When you thought no one outside your circle was listening, you told the truth. You revealed what you actually believe. And now you're upset that truth became public. You had no right. I had every right. Those messages were about me. About my body. About my children who don't even exist yet. About whether I was suitable for your precious bloodline. If you didn't want those thoughts documented, you shouldn't have written them down. She sat back down heavily, put her face in her hands. When she looked up, there were tears. Real ones, I think. Not strategic. Not performed. Just the grief of someone realizing they had been exposed as exactly who they were when they thought they could hide behind politeness. What do you want? She asked. What will it take for you to tell them it wasn't you? I can't tell them something that would be a lie. So you're admitting it. I'm saying that truth matters more than your comfort. And if that admission costs me this marriage, this house, this life you think I should be grateful for, then that's a cost I've already decided I'm willing to pay. She left without another word. I heard her car pull away. Heard the gravel crunch under tires as she fled back to whatever strategy session was happening at the family estate. I sat alone in that living room and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not quite peace, but something close. The clarity that comes from finally saying out loud what you've been thinking in private. The relief of dropping a mask that never fit right anyway. Richard came home late. Didn't ask what his mother had wanted. Didn't ask what we talked about. Just went straight to his study and closed the door. We were living in the same house but existing in separate realities. He was trying to preserve something that was already gone. I was preparing for whatever came next. Because something would come next. That was certain. Whether it was divorce papers or lawsuits or simply the cold exclusion families practice when someone refuses to pretend anymore, something was coming. And this time I would face it as myself. Not as the version of me that fit their frame. Not as the grateful outsider learning to belong. Just as me. The woman who had survived worse than their judgment. The woman who had built a life before them and could build one after. The woman who had rewritten their legacy and was now writing her own. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. Not a surprise. Not even particularly painful. Just the legal formalization of what had already ended the night I found that group chat. Richard's lawyer was efficient. Courteous. The settlement was generous. More than I expected, actually. Enough that I wondered if it was guilt or just the price of my silence about everything else I knew. I signed without negotiation. Money had never been the point. The foundation's reforms moved forward slowly. New board members were added. Scholarship criteria were updated. Budget allocations shifted on paper. But 6 months later, when I checked their public filings, the actual numbers told a different story. They had renamed programs, reworded mission statements, created the appearance of change while maintaining the structure that had always served them. Some people called it progress. I called it proof that systems don't transform themselves. They just learn to disguise their original purpose more carefully. But something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. The website became a resource. Other people started submitting documentation about other foundations. Other family organizations claiming public benefit while practicing private exclusion. The site evolved from an exposé of one institution into an archive of a pattern. A collective record of how wealth protects itself through the language of generosity. Students started reaching out. Not just those rejected by the Westwood Foundation, but young people navigating similar systems everywhere. Asking how to recognize the gap between stated values and actual practices. How to document patterns. How to build cases without losing themselves in anger. I started responding. Quietly. Anonymously at first. Then more openly. Sharing what I had learned about patience as strategy. About how the most effective resistance often looks like compliance until it doesn't. My son visited that spring. We walked through a park near my new apartment. Smaller than the estate, but mine in a way that house never was. He asked if I regretted it. Any of it. The marriage. The exposure. Cost. I thought about that question for a long time. Watched children playing on swings. Couples walking dogs. Life happening normally while underneath, quietly, power structures were being questioned by people who had finally seen the receipts. I regret believing I needed their acceptance, I said. I regret the months I spent trying to fit into a space that was never designed for me. But exposing them. Well, that I would do again. Exactly the same way. He smiled. The same smile I had seen on his face when he graduated college, when he got his first real job, when he called to tell me he had bought a house. Pride. Not in what he had been given, but in what he had built despite every barrier. You taught me that, he said. You just finally applied it to yourself. The Westwood family disappeared from public life gradually. Not dramatically. No scandals beyond the initial exposure. They just became quieter, less visible. Richard remarried 2 years later. Someone from their world. Someone who understood the unspoken rules. Someone who would never think to document the contradictions. I saw the wedding announcement online. Felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just distance. Like reading about strangers. But the foundation's practices became case studies. Featured in nonprofit management courses. Discussed in ethics seminars. Used as examples of what not to do when claiming commitment to equity. Their legacy wasn't what they had intended, but it was the one they had earned through their choices. I started speaking at conferences eventually. Not about the Westwood Foundation specifically, but about patterns. About how systems maintain themselves. About the difference between performance and practice. About why documentation matters more than accusations. About how change requires both exposure and alternative models. People would approach me afterward. Share their own stories. Their own evidence. Their own moments of deciding that truth mattered more than belonging to spaces that required them to be smaller. If you've ever felt torn between keeping peace and speaking truth, leave a comment about how you navigated that choice. Because these stories matter. They show others they're not alone. They build collective memory of what accountability actually looks like. And if this resonated with you, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. More moments where someone decided their dignity was worth more than their access. More examples of how patience and precision can dismantle what power and privilege built. I think about that night often. The one where I sat in the guest room reading messages about my skin tone, my suitability, my place in their bloodline. How small I felt in that moment. How close I came to just leaving. Disappearing back into my old life. Accepting that some spaces would never welcome me no matter what I achieved. But I didn't disappear. I documented. And that documentation became something bigger than my hurt. It became evidence. Proof. A mirror held up to people who had spent their lives avoiding their own reflection. It became permission for others to trust what they saw. To name what they experienced. To understand that when systems consistently produce unequal results, the problem isn't the people excluded. It's the system itself. I'm 55 now. 3 years since the wedding. Since the discovery. Since the exposure that rewrote their legacy and wrote mine. I live alone. Work as a consultant helping nonprofits audit their own practices before someone else does. I teach them how to align their values with their actions. How to build systems that actually serve the communities they claim to support. How to recognize when they're recycling privilege instead of redistributing opportunity. Some people think what I did was revenge. Maybe it was. But if so, it was the kind that doesn't diminish you. The kind that's indistinguishable from justice. The kind that says, I will not disappear to make you comfortable. I will not pretend your performance is the same as practice. I will not protect your reputation at the expense of truth. Richard's family thought I was too dark for their lineage. They measured my worth by my proximity to whiteness. By my willingness to assimilate. By my gratitude for access to spaces that should never have been restricted in the first place. But I rewrote their legacy. Not by destroying it. They did that themselves through years of choices that contradicted their claims. I just documented those choices. Made them visible. Turned their private beliefs into public record. And in doing so, I wrote my own story. One where a black woman in her 50s, underestimated and dismissed, became the architect of accountability they never saw coming. That's the thing about legacies. They're not what you claim. They're what you do when you think no one's watching. And if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, someone is always watching. Someone is always taking notes. Someone is always building the case that will outlive your carefully constructed image. I was that someone. And I'd do it again. Every single time. Because dignity isn't negotiable. Truth isn't optional. And belonging to spaces that require you to betray yourself isn't belonging at all. It's erasure with better lighting. Chose myself. Finally. Completely. And that choice, more than any marriage or family or acceptance, became the foundation of everything that came after. The legacy I'm actually building. The one that's mine.